Hi, I'm John Papola, and you're listening to the Emergent Order podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I have a great conversation with Steven Horwitz. Steve is a professor of economics at Ball State University and a longtime classical liberal who I've personally learned a lot from over the years, and brings a really interesting and unique perspective to issues around social change and how to think about them from a classical liberal perspective. He's recently published a piece over at libertarianism.org titled "Libertarians Who Dismiss Social Justice Are Mistaken." And it's an important and provocative piece for people who see themselves as libertarian or classical liberal, asking to take a second look at this important subject, especially in this era of public protest over the death of George Floyd and the structures and institutions in American society that really deserve a second look and a deeper look. And so I share this conversation with you in the hope of encouraging an open, loving discourse so that we can build a better country and a better world. So, Steve, you are the second video interview for our humble little podcast, the first being Brian Kaplan. But in a very real sense, you should have been the first, because outside of Russ, who of course I had be my first guest when we started doing the podcast a year ago, you were maybe the only other person to see the original lyrics to Fear the Boom and Bust, which was the project that started it all for me and for our company and for all the work we do. Yeah. So we've always got a very special place in my heart, Steve.
Well, thanks, John. I love telling the story. I mean, because I didn't know who you were, right? And there was no reason to know me. I was, and I was giving this talk at Fee, and this guy comes up to me with this crazy hair and says, "Can I, introduce you? Can I ask a favor?" Sure. Says, "Well, I'm writing this rap on the Keynes Hayek debate. Would you take a look at the lyrics?" And I'm like, I gotta take a step back. I've met this guy before. It's
the likelihood that I might have been planning to eat you for dinner was higher.
Was non-zero. Yes, non-zero. But when I tell the story, I always say I looked at that first. I don't know how close those were to done. They were pretty close to done because a lot of it was still there. But I was so impressed. They were just so great. And I was like, and then you said, "Oh, I'm working with Russ Roberts." I said, "Well, okay, now we got something here." So no, it's great. And the other, I don't know if you know the other story I like to tell about that video, which is, so I was still a skeptic, right? I'm like, okay, the lyrics are great. I feel better, but what is this thing going to look like? And who wants to watch a video about that? I mean, so I was very skeptical. And then, I wasn't at the AA meetings when you previewed it, but somebody else was and said to me, "Wow, it was really great. It was much better than I expected." And so I can't remember who it was right now. So I'm like, all right, I can believe the production values are great. And I said, but who's going to watch this? Who are kids going to watch this thing? And then I show it in class, right? And they love it. And I'm like, and I'm still not believing. I'm like, well, okay, but these are my students, right? Of course they're my students. And then, 4 million views later, don't ever listen to Horwitz, just because I don't know. I don't know what's happening.
So to take a couple steps back, I started this journey of trying to understand the world in a deeper way as best I could. And one of the writers I came across, obviously, was Russ in the Econ Talk podcast. This is, 2006 and 2007. But you popped to the surface, and it was actually probably first on your blog that you did with Pete Betke. And we've already interviewed Pete and talked at length about Mises and Marx on the episode we did with Pete Betke. But tell me about, for people that don't know you and your work, just, give me your background. You're an economist, right. You're a free marketeer, you're into this Austrian school. or Austro-Swedish school, or whatever the hell you want to call it.
No, we'll stay with Austrian economics.
Yeah, classical liberal,
Yeah.
bottom-up type of guy. But where did that start? How did you first get interested in
Yeah.
economics?
Yeah. So this is another. Everyone has their origin story, right? All libertarians have an origin story, and I was in high school. I go way back, right? So this is a high school thing. In high school, I was one of those kind of classic geeky mid-teens high school kids. I read a lot of sci-fi, and I was just sort of interested in anyone with a weird theory of the world. So I even read like Bible prophecy. So like Chariots of the Gods was one of my favorite books for a long time, because this was like, this was like the key, right? You understand the world now. And I also was working at the public library at the time. And one day, the new books would come across, and this book comes across, and it seemed like here was another guy with another interesting theory of the world. And it was a book called Restoring the American Dream by Robert Ringer. Now, Ringer was known in libertarian circles. This would have been 1979, 1980. I think the book is from 79, maybe. Ringer was known, he was an investment guru guy and looking out for number one and this kind of stuff. But he wrote this book on sort of an intro to libertarianism in the sort of Ed Clark campaigns, again, 79, 80 period. And so I said, here's another guy with here. I picked up the book and read it and had this experience of, this is what I've always kind of believed, but never been able to articulate, right? This is my people, right? These are my people. And so I did what any precocious mid-teenager who worked at a library would do. And I said, all right, let's look at his bibliography. Who are the books who is he talking about? That would be the next book if I wanted to read more about this, right? Because that's, 15 years old. That's what I was. And this is the part that'll crack you up. What's the next book I read that our public library had was Rothbard's For a New Liberty. So
that was an early one for me, I have to say, too.
Right,
For a New Liberty, and it was Rothbard is so fiery.
Yeah. And like Ayn Rand, right? You're particularly open to that, I think, in your teens and in college years. And so I went right into the deep end, right? Here's the anarcho-capitalist argument, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay, right.
Big time deep end.
Yeah, and so the other piece of the puzzle is around the same time, I took AP American Literature. And the woman who taught that course in my high school had on the reading list The Fountainhead, which was awesome. And I didn't realize until my later years just how awesome and brave it was for her to put that on that reading list. So I read The Fountainhead, would have been spring of 1980. And then I said, all right, well, I got to read Atlas Shrugged now. And this is totally true story. I said, all right, well, school's out in June. I'll buy it and I'll read it over the summer. Because, it's a big book. I started it. I didn't sleep for 2 days. I pretty much read it straight through in 48 hours. And
I couldn't read.
The rest.
I'm a slow reader. There is not. It would take like amphetamines or something for me to have any hope of achieving that goal, even with no sleep.
Right. I thought I was a fast reader. Then I married Squire, who I can't even keep up with how fast she reads.
That's the ultimate superpower for me.
Right. It is. Great.
I wish I could just like read a book in a day. It'd be so great.
Tyler Cowen, who appears to read a lot of books. I'm not totally convinced he reads all of them all the way through, but okay. And Tyler once said, it took me 30 years to learn how to read this book so quickly. And his point being that you can read more quickly. I find myself when I read now sort of skimming over things because I know what the author's going to say, right? I just know it. And I know what's important. And I sort of have this accumulated capital in reading that lets me, I'm in the middle of a very different kind of book right now. I'm reading Jonathan Sacks's book, The Dignity of Difference, which people who follow me on Facebook will notice I've been quoting Rabbi Sacks recently. And this is a little different book, but even here, right, I can read it pretty quickly because I kind of know, I know what I'm looking for and I know what he's going to say in some ways. And so, yeah. But so just to finish the story, so I ended up going off to University of Michigan, and I was going to be a computer science major. But I was still a hardcore libertarian. And my spring of my freshman year, my second semester, I needed one more course. And I thought to myself, well, if you're going to do this libertarian stuff, it's probably a good idea. You should know some economics, right? And so I took intro econ. and then had the other experience, the experience that economists have, which is, oh my God, right? This makes sense of the world. And sort of that same feeling. This is the way I've always thought about things. And now I have this systematic way of approaching it. And you just, Bourdieu says the scales fall from your eyes and you're entranced, you fall in love. And so I majored in economics and philosophy. And I would say by the end of my sophomore year in college, pretty much everything that's happened to me since then is what I wanted to do by that point, to go to George Mason, get a PhD, teach at the college level. My dad is a retired college professor. Teach at the college level. My biggest goal, Pete Betke would tell you this story too. Our biggest goal in grad school was to have a book listed in the old Laissez-faire books catalog. We thought if we could just do that, if we could just have that, we wouldn't need anything else, right? So all these things that have happened have been wonderful. And I have to say, and I'm happy to talk more about this if you want, but where I am right now dealing with a cancer diagnosis, that's a good feeling, right? It's a good feeling to sort of look back and say, you know what? I set out, there were things I wanted to do. There was a life I had imagined and I got it mostly, right? So, that's a good thing.
Well, I think that it's one of these incredible things when you can set out to engage in intellectual things as a job.
Yeah.
It's exciting. It's certainly how I see my job and what we do at our company. And it's weird that it's a company and it's like it's like a purpose-driven company, but I want to talk to you about this piece you wrote about social justice, because I think it's so interesting. And I think you bring a really important take to it. But before I do, you're looking back on an academic life that's continuing and hopefully is going to be continuing for many, many years and decades to come, Steve, because I love you and I want, nothing would.
You and me both.
Come on, man. You hang in there.
Yeah, we're kicking it right now. We're kicking it. So
stay out of Walmart. But what's your take on what's happening in academia? Because, and I ask that as somebody who, so if you're coming to this and you're hearing us talk about these terms like libertarianism or whatever, because, we're not fundamentally like a political company or a political podcast, but that's a political philosophy. And I don't like to lean into the worst angels of my nature. And the worst angels of my nature is, well, academia has become kind of a cesspool of despair where free speech is being crushed and where 25% of the social scientists in scare quotes, self-identify in surveys as being Marxist, which is like believing in sort of a pre-germ theory of disease level science from my perspective. And so I can go down this dark road, but I don't find that might all be true. Yeah. But I don't think it's necessarily true. I want to hear what your take is, because I think there's a lot of bombastic stuff. And is it just like there's a minority of loud jerks on college campuses wrecking it for everybody? Or is the groupthink and the cancel culture and is it as bad as it seems from the outside?
So a couple of thoughts. I have to preface it all with saying my experience of academia has been uniformly wonderful. And my experience, I was at St. Lawrence for 27, 28 years. And, I don't know what my colleagues thought of me when they were alone and I wasn't in the room, I can't say. But what I can say is that I was always treated with respect. And, I was an associate dean for 6 years. I was department chair for 6 years. I got voted into a named chair it was a chair that we vote on as faculty. So my own colleagues voted me into that chair. I used to joke the one thing that they couldn't stand, the one thing about my politics, whatever, that drove them bonkers wasn't the sort of free market stuff per se, was that I didn't vote. and I was a non-voter, a conscientious abstainer, as I like to call it.
You don't want to encourage the bastards?
That's right, exactly. In college, I still found the pin recently. I used to have a pin that was U.S. out of North America, right? It was, so, but anyway, so my experience has been great. And my experience at Ball State now has been equally great. And so I do think a couple of things. I think it is a minority of folks who we see inordinate attention paid to. And I think it's particularly true at elite schools, right? If you get past the elite schools, and I think particularly if you get past the elite liberal arts colleges, right? But St. Lawrence is a sort of, second tier, top of the second tier liberal arts college. And we're too busy teaching students, and we're too concerned about teaching them well, I think, to have too much time for a lot of nonsense. And even, things had gotten a little more like other places when I left, but still not a problem, right? In fact, my farewell remarks to the faculty were to remind them to not fall into that abyss. And I think at mid-level, like a Ball State, these kids, these are first generation college students, right? They don't have time for this stuff. They want a damn education. And most of us who are teaching there, right? Same thing. So I think it's a localized and loud phenomenon, amplified, of course, now by social media, particularly by the dumpster fire that is Twitter. And that's not to say it isn't real, right? I mean, I do think there is a younger generation of, I'll say the word scholars, though you can put that in scare quotes if you want to, younger generation of faculty for whom, these issues are more salient, and sort of the cancel culture and these sorts of things really are, part of who they are, and they're convinced of their own wokeness and moral authority. And I think it's really, it is a tougher environment. And I should also note, I'm biased being in economics where, events of the last couple of weeks noted, where it seems to be creeping into econ a bit. Even so, right, it's a really different environment. So that, I think that has to be taken with a word. My philosopher friends would, I think, have a different take. But my experience, again, even with a small liberal arts college with people from other disciplines, was we could talk about stuff, and there was mutual respect there. So I think it's real. And I think if one question like this, if I were a parent of a college-bound kid, what would I do, right?
Yeah. So what would you do?
A couple of things. One, first question I'd be asking is, does my kid really need to go to college? That's the first question. I think, I don't buy this whole college is complete nonsense story. Your previous guest so noted. But I also, he wouldn't say nonsense. He'd say there's value in the signal. But I also, don't think everyone should go. And I think too many kids go to college who would be better off either not going or waiting a year or two or three. And I think we're going to see some of that with COVID. So that's the first question. But the second question would be, I would go to places and if I were a parent, and I did this with my own kids a few years back, go and talk, ask questions and sort of, talk to faculty if you can, sit in on a class if you can. I would ask the question to administrators if you can about intellectual diversity on campus, and see how, see what they answer. It could be a load of nonsense, but that's important, right? And if you can, talk to students, because the students will tell you things they won't say publicly or often in front of other students. So I think you just got to really be careful and ask around. I do think there's there used to be these sort of, I think there might still be a conservative guide to colleges sort of thing. I think there needs to be a classical liberal one too, right? That, everyone's, go to Hillsdale. No, well, Hillsdale's got its own stuff going on too. But I think there's plenty of other schools out there that you can be comfortable with as a classical liberal. I mean, I went to University of Michigan, for God's sake, as a hardcore libertarian, and not only survived, I had a great time. I had great faculty, one of whom I'm still in touch with, right? So,
So, what does it mean to be a classical liberal? So someone who's hearing us talk, and we've sort of jumped right in a real familiar way, but, I think you and I probably would define our ideological, philosophical perspective similarly, but I want to hear it, like, for you. For someone comes in to hear us talking, they're like, what are you talking about, this classical liberal? What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, I think classical liberalism is a philosophy that attempts to maximize the freedom of individuals to trade as they wish, to speak as they wish, to sleep with whom they wish. That for classical liberals, that those freedoms are the key, are the most fundamental thing, and that it has some implications. One of which is that government should be minimal and limited in its powers. And that part of the belief in part of our belief in human freedom is the belief that at least under the right institutions, the right rules of the game, leaving people free to exchange and speak and interact with other human beings as they wish will produce patterns of outcomes, emergent orders, one might say, that are beneficial, that generate progress. Right? We in the market, right? As an economist, we know that markets under the right rules and institutions, people are led by an invisible hand to promote an end that was none of their intention, and that good things result, and that markets have led to the progress, human progress, and particularly progress of the least well off. And for me, in this, we can talk about this in light of the social justice stuff, I think classical liberals have historically, and need to remember that we have historically been champions of the least well off. But I think the same sort of idea of order and progress without a designer we can see in the realm of science and speech and all realms of human interaction. So the liberalism there is the idea of human freedom and the attempt to minimize coercion and to limit the state's powers. And the classical part, of course, is that this is a tradition that goes back hundreds of years, right? We sometimes use the word libertarian now to differentiate it from modern liberalism. But that broader classical liberal tradition is a long one.
Yeah, it's in very interesting times because I've always liked classical liberal as a term, and I think it's partly because having kind of come to these ideas, growing up fairly conservative, being exposed to people like Hayek and your writings and others have made me more liberal in a lot of dimensions.
Good.
So there's a kind of, we have so many overlaying things going on right now that if you're a really, truly classical liberal minded person, they're head scramblers. So one of them is the presidency of Donald Trump, which is not especially classical liberal. It has like these little pockets of, he's cut a bunch of regulation and maybe the tax policy wasn't the worst, although, Milton Friedman would say, don't look at the taxes, look at the spending.
That's right. Yeah.
So, low taxes, high spending today means high taxes tomorrow. But it's not a classical liberal orientation. It's a very top-down authoritarian orientation, very power, very, we see that.
Right. And one thing I would add, right, I think that classical liberalism is, and I've tried to make this case, is inherently cosmopolitan. It recognizes that we're all connected globally, that human beings are human beings. It's a story about human rights, not American citizens' rights. And I think one of the worst sins of the Trump administration is to undermine it's a terrible sin, but it's also one of the most fundamental ways it is not, in any sense of the term, classical liberal, is precisely its rejection of that cosmopolitanism. I mean,
both in terms of the treatment of immigration and globalization and free trade.
That's right. They're both right. People and goods cross borders, and that's
yeah. Some other guy that was a jerk in high school now got elected and draws a line between you and me, and suddenly what we're doing isn't legal anymore. Like that to me, at the most like kindergarten level is like, isn't that just bullying? Is that just
it is.
What is that?
Right. And the thing is, we forget. It's easy to forget that we can't just regulate one side of an exchange. When we say people can't cross borders, and when we say goods can't cross borders, it's not that we're just regulating the people who are trying to come to the United States or trade in the United States. We're regulating the behavior of Americans too, right? I mean, so there's no sense in which, that kind of protectionism and that kind of anti-immigration, stuff is anything but restrictions on the freedoms of Americans. There's just no way to salvage it in terms of a classical liberal worldview.
So one of the so you've got that thread, right? And because he's you've been at this longer than me. So why is it, in your perspective, that classical liberals, libertarians have generally tended to be seen as on the political right of center in America? And I think it's an interesting time to ask that question, because you have people who have long called themselves conservatives, Jonah Goldberg, George Will, people who, again, like, for the average person, maybe these are not household names, but if you're into politics, or, you like to read philosophical, ideological stuff, you probably know about George Will, you maybe know about Jonah Goldberg. They now are tending to call themselves classical liberal. But it's in part a kind of rejection of the movement on the political right, and especially about Trump. So how did that, why is that the case? I look at like somebody like JFK, and he's like more classical liberal in a lot of respects than like George W. Bush.
Yeah, I think
so. How did this all happen? Why is Donald Trump Jr. going to be speaking at Freedom Fest, which is an ostensibly libertarian event coming up like that? Like, how is there this fusion?
I think so. I think the answer comes in two stages. There's a historical story, which is anti-socialism, right? I mean, both, conservatives and classical liberal. But let's back up one more step. We think about the 20th century. We forget that there was a time in the 20s and 30s and 40s where all intellectuals were socialists. I mean, it just was, right? You just were a socialist, and socialist ideas were on the rise, and we were seeing them in pieces anyway, put into practice in places. Even, I'm not even thinking like Soviet Union, Great Britain, and so on, right? So I think for classical liberals, there was a sort of, a partnership of necessity with true conservatives in their mutual concern over socialism, and their quite reasonable fear that socialism would destroy Western civilization, right? And this is, that shared commitment and those shared ideas, I think, were part of why libertarians and classical liberals ended up on the right. Okay, and I think so fast forward, right? The interesting event is the fall of the Berlin Wall. Right now, socialism is dead. So why? For now, right? Well, we thought it was dead. It's like a scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Not quite dead. But the question, I thought that would fracture, right? I mean, I thought that now that was out of the way, classical liberals and conservatives could differentiate themselves. And it didn't happen, and then we got 9/11 and all these, other things that 9/11 in particular led to this revival of nationalism, and I think made possible, created an environment in which a Trump could come along and be successful in doing the things he's done. But I think the thing to keep in mind is there is what I think unites the Trumpists and the right today is their first priority is to own the libs. There's no program of their own. It's simply, how do we piss off the people who we perceive have all the cultural power and who have done all these things? And so, I mean, that's the only way to understand. I mean, that's part of, it's the only way. It's one way to understand Trump and to understand the people who support, and especially people who support him, but know all his flaws, right? I mean, evangelicals being one group, but others too, right? Why? Well, because the other guys are so much worse, and it's so much fun to finally have a guy who stand up and poke at them in the way they've been poking at us for a while. And it's a kind of weird Schadenfreude revenge thing. I think that is part of this, and that's unfortunate because it's not a political philosophy. It's just anger and so on. I think the most and your point about Trump Jr. speaking at Freedom Fest, if you recall, Trump spoke there in 2015. It was one of his earliest events, right, where he was sort of thinking about doing this. There's been nothing more disappointing to me in the last few years than to realize how many self-described classical liberals and libertarians were just contrarians. That in the end of the day, and I think this grew out of Ron Paul too, right? The support for these people and the use of that name was simply to be different. and to be contrarian, and in some cases to provide intellectual cover for their racism and their sexism and their xenophobia. But the moment Trump came along and gave voice to that and gave them someone they could glom onto, there they went. And you know, that's, you can tell by my exasperation.
Well,
sad.
And I will say I'm not always a huge fan of these posts from you, but you have been a vociferous sort of interior to this world critic of libertarians.
Yeah, someone has to do
it. You know, you're definitely somebody who, as a libertarian, will often post what libertarians should be doing is insert Steve's thought.
Yeah, well, it's my role model there in some ways is Deirdre McCloskey, who got the nickname Auntie D for scolding the economics profession about what it should do, and so I admit to being a bit of a scold, but we can be, and we have been, so much better than that, and it's, the ideas are too good and too important, and the cause is too just to let the bad guys have the name and to let that behavior define us, right? I mean, I can't. I mean, just going back to where we were a little while ago, I've been at this since 40 years now, right? Since 1980, 79, 80, right? And I'm too invested in it to let the bad guys steal it.
You know, I think that one of the things that's so interesting to me is, and we're gonna, so much of this will be like great underpinnings for the conversation about social justice, because I think it all ladders up to why does that term, how do you filter that term at the gut level, before you even start to process ways of thinking about it, or understanding it. But I think that there's a temperamental component to people's politics that might even point towards the genetics of it. You know, I know, like Brian and some of these twin studies, even for people who've seen Three Identical Strangers, it's sort of like the documentary manifestation of the twin studies, where I don't want to give too much away, but you have three identical twins that were raised in very different backgrounds, very different family lives, and yet all end up having these remarkable similarities. They're not clones of each other, but they're more similar. If you believe that that we are born as a blank slate, I don't know how you believe that in live and interact with people, or have ever met a child. But I mean, I'm being dismissive of it because I think it doesn't survive any human experience to believe people are a blank slate. But it is somewhat upsetting how much of our predilections and temperaments might be a little ordained in our genes, at least set by default. And so do you think there's something, you called some of the so-called libertarians contrarians. Is there something, maybe not about liberal or classical liberal or libertarian ideas, but is there something about that, about because it's fundamentally kind of an anti-authority philosophy. And is there like a temperament of being sort of screw the man kind of posture?
I don't know if
that sits below the philosophy that is sort of the driver of it.
I don't know if it's a temperament per se. I do think it's a feature of adolescence, of young people, right? One of the things I think a lot about when I teach intro econ, especially, is the idea of I'm giving these young people this set of ideas that their friends don't have, and they get a kind of contrarianism out of it, a kind of cool cachet, right? I mean, my vision is the friends are arguing over some politics, late night in a dorm, and one of my students is sitting there just listening, kind of coolly, casually. Finally says, "You don't know, here's what's, here's another way of looking at it. Here's what's really going on." And I do think there's an appeal to young people. I mean, that's my own history, right? Is that. So I think that contrarianism appeals to young people in a certain sort of way. And we think about adolescence now lasting into the 20s. And so I think that to me is more of an explanation than something that's sort of an evolutionary, I think there are some interesting evolutionary reasons why people don't like markets, right? Hayek has certainly talked about, and I think he's on to something there, sort of evolutionary psychology type stuff. But I think in terms of why people, I'm not sure there's that kind of disposition to contrarianism. I think that contrarianism is a social phenomena of adolescence, where kids just want to rebel against all their parents and I mean, even the use of the word normie, right? And that whole culture is all sort of rebellion and trolling culture and all these kind of things, right, are all about that. And I think that's a better explanation of, and I think that really is, you know, the sadly, it often attracts young people to classical liberal ideas because they are different and an outlier and contrarian in a real sense. But it also makes them, if that contrarianism is what they get stuck on, then they're susceptible to the worst kinds of stuff, right? I think the real key is to grab the contrarianism and root it in ideas and principles in a way that immunizes them to pure contrarianism.
So, you know, to the extent that, you know, 17-year-olds get Atlas Shrugged and get super stoked about it. And
I was that's
one path. But for, I think maybe more, they get stoked about somebody that's more like Marx and is calling for revolution and change and equality and those things. Who doesn't like equality at some level, and who doesn't want change when you see a world that's got problems? And so I think this sort of takes us to, you know, why I reached out to you, right? Which is this notion of social justice. So if a classical liberal is saying, look, we want individual human rights, universal individual human rights, the right to be left alone, but more importantly, the right to live peacefully and interact peacefully with other people. So you can't beat people up, steal their stuff.
Right.
If you make something or you find something first, it's yours. If you
finders keepers,
you know, if you write a contract and you break it, that's wrong. You know, these basic ideas are the kind of classical liberal toolkit. You have these other frameworks, and so before we get into what you wrote, like, give me a primer on this. Like, what? Because social justice isn't talking about simply like this individualistic framework. That's the word social, I think, is meant specifically to separate it from that, or to put it as opposed to that, perhaps. But so what is social justice? Where did I think this phrase is pretty old.
Yep.
But where does it come from? What has it meant?
Yeah. I think so. Historically, the idea behind social justice was, as you say, that ensuring justice, and particularly justice in outcomes, was not merely about the individual choices, but that we collectively had some responsibility for ensuring some pattern of outcomes. So, you know, clearly that opens up room for the state to step in and redistribute and pass, you know, do other kinds of laws, whatever, to ensure that that justice is done. And normally this, I mean, historically this was it was class-based. It was a concern about the poor, concern about making sure that folks who didn't have a lot had enough. And so that use of social justice it wasn't, you know, if you think about it, and if every individual behaved justly, we might still have an outcome in which some people are left behind, are poor, or whatever. And if we believe we have an obligation to lift them up and make sure at least they reach some minimum standard, then the belief by many was, okay, that's now about social justice. We need to intervene in ways to make sure that happens. I think what happened over the 20th century is that term, like so much else, got expanded out of class, beyond class, into race and gender and all of these other kinds of categories, identity categories that we think about, where we say, well, you know, it's true. If we look at African Americans in the United States, their outcomes compared to whites are notably worse. What can we, you know, that's a problem of social justice, right? So what do we do? And similarly, right, you know, gender, though less so, and certainly better than it used to be with gender. And you can make the same argument about gay and trans and all the rest. So I think that's the sort of, origins of it. And I think, and there's a noble instinct there, right? And there's a liberal instinct, classical liberal instinct there too, which is to make sure that folks who that institutions work to the interests of the better off, and the least well off, and make sure that they're made better off.
So I think there's two to dig into that a little bit more, because I know I've heard you talk about John Stuart Mill, as being someone who sort of, if you want to sort of be if you want to break down well-intended people who want the world to be better into two categories that make more sense than left and right. I think maybe you could say people who approach things from a kind of individual rights perspective, and people who approach things from a kind of collective or class perspective. Would you say that's maybe like a decent way to?
Right. Or I think, which maps closely, is people who think that beneficial social outcomes can come unintended, versus those who think that you need designer's a strong term.
Policy, social policy.
Yeah. So
you have Mill, you have Hume, you have like Adam Smith and the moral sentiments in particular. You have these grappling with what does a just society look like. I mean, you can obviously go back to Plato, and
right.
I mean, this notion of justice is part of mainline philosophy, going all the way back to the Greeks, and certainly in other traditions, I'm sure, as well. But the social part comes in kind of particular forms in particular ways. So in this piece, which you wrote for the libertarianism.org, it's libertarians who dismiss social justice are mistaken is your title. So you're poking.
You say it's my title,
or the title which was ascribed to the
there you go. Yeah, but I'm fine with it.
It's a very Horwitzian title, though.
Yes, it is.
Knowing you in your Facebook feed.
Yeah.
But so you make I'm going to read a little bit from the top. You say, although some libertarians are comfortable with the term, quote, social justice, it's probably fair to say that a clear majority is not, often citing Hayek's critique of the term, or generally rejecting the set of policy proposals that they assume come along with endorsing the term. For many years, I was part of that majority, but over the last decade or so, I have become much more comfortable with the idea that libertarians can and should be advocates for social justice. I hope to make that case in what follows. So, the first part. So, Friedrich Hayek, classical liberal economist, 21st century rap star. He pushed back against this concept of social justice in a particular conception of it. So lay out what did he have to say? Because he was a smart guy. And
he was, and he wasn't wrong. Okay, I mean, I think so. To go back to where we were a little bit ago, right? If what is meant by social justice is some sort of relative of social planning, that is, we need to sort of create a top-down set of policies that will redistribute wealth or income or resources, according to some preset pattern. Hayek had sort of two objections to this. First was a sort of philosophical one, which is to say, justice has to be connected up with intention, with action, right? That if I club you over the head, I'm being unjust, right? We know who engaged in the unjust action. We can identify me, and we can decide how we want to handle that socially. The problem with social justice is, Hayek said, is that there's no actor there, right? There's no, it doesn't make sense as a category of justice because we can't identify who's responsible for the injustice. Right. And so his argument was, if you accept that meaning of justice, right, social justice is it's a nonsense term. It doesn't make any sense, right? Secondly, even if you accept that it makes sense, right, then we sort of have the problem with redistribution and top-down planning and all these sorts of things, which is to say, and this is the same argument that Robert Nozick, the philosopher around the same time, actually made against John Rawls, which is liberty upsets patterns, right? If you decide that what you have to do is make the world conform to a particular pattern of outcome, either you got to restrict people's liberty significantly in order to try to make that happen, and Hayek would add, and that's still not going to work, or you just can't do it, and you got to give people freedom and accept the fact that it's never going to meet some pattern. So I think that those two things together are sort of why Hayek thought that social justice, as he understood that term, and was probably true of that term, you know, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right, was nonsense.
So, you know, we just did this long sought for myself, and finally realized Mises versus Marx, the sort of third rap video.
And it's great. It's great.
And you know, you had long said, "Oh, I can't wait for you to read Mises," because I had really not read a lot of Mises. And Mises makes these points. He's far more strident than Hayek, and which I actually kind of like. I think it makes for better reading. But
yeah, it's a little sprightlier.
Yeah, but he starts with this basic thing that I think Hayek is sharing in what you described, right? Which is that when we use terms like "we decide," or that America went to war, or that China is cheating us, that these are sort of a linguistic fiction, that there is not, and people bristle when you hear that, when they hear this, but that there isn't really a we, as it's in the sense that the sort of shorthand is being used. When a group of people get together and an outcome that affects all of them emerges out of their conversation, like where are we going to eat? It isn't really we decide, unless every single person was in 100% agreement, total 100% consensus. If there was any dissent, it isn't really we, it is some. And so the question is then, that outcome is what we could call an emergent outcome. Maybe you took a vote, maybe you drew straws, you did some process.
That's right. To
arrive at the outcome, but it was not a choice by like a hive mind, in the same way that we think of our own choices that we make in our heads, right? Is that a fair?
Right. I think that's right. And two quick points, and then I'll say more. It's also true when we say things like Walmart lowered prices, right?
Right.
That's another that, you know, it's not, and
corporations are just a legal fiction.
That's right.
Just a group of people with some contracts.
That's right. And so all of these things are, as you say, processes of individual exchange, action, negotiation, conversation, but as you also noted, they're structured by rules and processes, right? So we you know, you, like you said, you have to have some way of deciding where you're going for lunch, and whatever it is, right? Those rules of the game that's what filters our individual choices to produce those outcomes. And I think that's a really important point, because people sometimes forget this when we talk about, you know, people say, well, self-interest leads to, you know, even defenders of market say self-interest leads to great outcomes, right? Greed is good. No, depends on the rules, right? Because me clubbing you over the head is still greedy self-interest, but we don't think of that as being socially good, because those are not, you know, rules that let me do that are not good rules. So I think that's, I think that's, we always have to remember there's no we in that sense, right?
And so there's a justice then, right? That and these are maybe, and I'm not an expert in this. Right. I haven't done deep reading on this, but I'm working on a project that derives a lot of its inspiration from The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff.
Yeah, great book.
And they spend some time at a kind of pop philosophy level trying to grapple with this concept of social justice, because they see it as being they attribute some of the issues in college campuses, and also just some of the psychology breakdown that people are experiencing, as being rooted in perhaps a ill-defined or inappropriate way of thinking about social justice. And one of the things that they say is, you know, you have distributive justice, equal outcomes. We all get the same, like a doctor and a plumber both make $75,000 a year because we all do, no matter what we do. That's the extreme version. But yeah, something akin to equal outcomes is justice. Or procedural justice, which is to say, yes, we have this process. So we're all going to get together. There's 10 of us. We're all diverse, but we've decided we've all come to this place because we're going to have dinner together, but there's disagreement over where to go. And so how do we figure that out so that there's procedural justice?
That's right.
And the outcome is going to be a kind of equal outcome in that particular instance. But what we're talking about, is it fair?
Right. I was just going to say, that's the word, is fair, right?
Is it fair is not really a question of whether we all get what we want. Some of us are going to not want to go out for Chinese, but we're going to end up there anyway because of the process.
Right. And so this is interesting because this is in Hayek, and it's also in Rawls and Buchanan, in James Buchanan, the Nobel economist, all in the same sort of way, basically said, if people agree on the rules, then the outcome is, and people obey the rules, then the outcome is just, right? I mean, I'm simplifying, but essentially, right, if we can come up with a set of rules that we all agree on, right, and then we play the game according to those rules, whatever the outcome of the game is just. And sports is the analogy here, right? If we agree on the rule, everyone agrees on the rules of, I'm a hockey fan, let's take hockey, agrees on the rules of hockey, and the rules are enforced fairly by the referees, right? That one team wins isn't, we can't say it's unjust, right? We agreed to the rules, right? So
distributive justice applied to that hockey game would suck.
Right. No, that's right. That's right.
It means you'd always have a tie.
Right.
And
right.
no one's gonna take any risks that might hurt themselves because the outcome doesn't matter anyway.
Right. And we have, I mean, my favorite example of this is you got the piece of cake left and you and your spouse or your sibling have to divide it up. You cut, I decide, right? That's a set of rules that we get it. We see what the thing is and the game theory works and we agree that it's fair. So, and you can't complain afterwards because you agreed to that procedure, right? Or, odds and evens or all this stuff. So, so yeah, I think that I think it is true. So the criticism of procedural justice is, from the left, is that it allows for these inequalities that even if we think they are fair in the sense of having gone through this procedure, leave some people in situations that are untenable, they're discriminated against, they're too poor to survive. I mean, whatever version of it you want to adopt, and they can say in some sense, and it's nobody's fault, right? There's that's the social component. It's frankly, I mean, for classical liberals, one way of thinking about it is an unintended consequence, right? It's an emergent outcome. I don't want to say order, but it's an emergent outcome that no one person's responsible for. But if you believe it's and I would add further, and this is more to sort of where I went in my own argument, if you think the rules are unfair, then you're going to get outcomes that seem unjust. But again, it's not easy to put a finger at to who acted unjustly. And we might see ways of correcting that unjust outcome in terms of fixing the rules. That is a better process as opposed to distributing or redistributing, right?
So, obviously, you've written this piece and it's published on June 10th, and right at the top, the first words are about the killing of George Floyd. And so, this piece is directed at people who, I think I've yet to see anyone who thinks that the killing of George Floyd was anything other than a miscarriage of justice and humanity.
Yeah, my Facebook feed says otherwise,
but well, yeah, I mean, that's right. There are actual horrible people out there who, but by and large, let's just say, I'll use my dad's a doctor, and he said, there's just 15% of people, they come in and they're one of those 15% that are just like miserable, terrible. Something's wrong with their life, but they're going to take it out on you.
10% of the students, 90% of the problems.
Yeah. So it's like, let's say somewhere between 10 and 15%, we'll set them off to the side. They need to relax, go to do some self-help. But for everybody else, it's like, oh, that was awful. That's horrible. Yeah. And then it opens a lot of questions about, okay, so, and now what?
Yeah.
And we have this movement, protests shading into mobs, some protests, some mobs, hopefully mostly protest, but definitely some mobs, asking for social justice. At the end of the day, that's kind of the big picture thing they're asking for, right? And so so what's the libertarian case to sort of lock arms with at least some of these folks?
Right.
I think that was kind of where you were headed.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Right. So I would start by saying we shouldn't reject the broad claim that you made, right? That this killing was a murder. It was a tragedy of justice. And that we want to live in a world where that doesn't happen, right? Or at least happens as infrequently as possible. And there's no perfection anywhere. So in that sense, right. And we should agree, I think, that with the call for justice here, call it social justice if you want to, for the reasons we've been talking about. The question then becomes, okay, how, what, right? And you know, if the answer is, well, this is just racism, it's just because white people are racist and that's what's doing this, right? I don't think it's not part of the explanation. It is, but if that's all it is, that doesn't get us very far, because then we're talking about people's hearts and so on, right? And that's why folks on the left will say, well, it's institutional racism, it's structural racism, it's built into the very institutions and structures. It's not about people's hearts. It's not about what people think or feel. It's about the way that those institutions are structured and how those produce racially disparate outcomes. And I think framed that generally, I think that's right. The question is which institutions, what pieces of them, and so on. And I think, you know, one of the interesting things about the George Floyd and BLM stuff is that libertarians have been on this police and sort of intersection of police and race and qualified immunity and all these issues that we've been talking about. We've been there for a long time. And Radley Balco, for God's sakes, has been, right. You know, he's a freaking hero. He's been on this for so long. And the militarization of the police as well, right? Chris Coyne's work and Abby Hall Blanco's work. So all this kind of stuff is there. And so we're pointing to those as the source of the problem and where to look for the solution. And I think that what the argument we're making is one about institutional and structural racism. The fact is that these institutions and these ways of doing things produce racially disparate outcomes. It means, you know, once you give power to cops, right, cops are going to exercise that power according, one, to their hearts, but also according to who it's easiest to pick on and, you know, where and so on. So it's no surprise, right? And for example, the enforcement of mask wearing rules, right? We already know it's being enforced 80-90% on minority communities, not on white folks at Kroger, right? So once you create, part of the institutional structural point is once you create these institutions of power, the outcomes are going to be racially unequal. And so the question is, it's not just about people's hearts, it's about fixing these institutions in ways, or changing the rules of the game in ways that don't let bad people do bad things.
So, you know, to lay out, break down for the skeptic who comes in and says, nah, this is all just, they want socialism or something. I don't know what this is.
Well, many of them do.
Or something. I don't trust it. I don't know what they're saying. Then whatever they're saying is different than what I think they actually want. Like, break down where you see the common ground for people of goodwill who see these things, and they use these terms, systematic or systemic. And you've used this term, institution. Yeah. You know, my grandfather used to say, you know, marriage is a great institution if you like institutions. And I think marriage is a great institution. Right. But I'm not sure if I like institutions. I guess it depends. If I'm in a straitjacket, I probably don't like them. Right. If it's hockey rules. So what does this mean? What is this? Let's start there. Yeah. You say this word institution. You and Betke and you know, these sort of new institutionalists love this word. It's still kind of a weird abstract word.
It is. It's very high level, right? Because it encompasses.
Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, it encompasses all of the rules and norms and practices that guide and govern human behavior, including in both formal and informal.
Sort of
so
tacit rules of the game.
The rules of the game are often tacit, right? It's nowhere written. I mean, this is pre-COVID, but if you walk up to someone and they extend their hand, you extend your hand, shake their hand, right? That's an informal rule, right? There's no law. It's not written down anywhere, but we know. So all of those things are under the broad category of institutions. And sometimes we use that word institution in a little bit narrower sense to refer to more formal ones like the police or the justice system in the cases we're talking about. Markets or property rights are institutions in that sense. They're all rules. All those things are rules of the game. So that's what we mean by institutions. And again, I think this, to stay with this analogy, right? If the rules are, if you change the rules, you change the incentives facing people, and you thereby change the outcomes, right? If you make field goals in football worth 5 points instead of 3, suddenly everybody's drafting kickers, and people are, kicking more field goals, right? So you can see how the strategy changes. Everything changes, right?
Yeah. So if you have the electoral college campaigns behave differently,
right. That's right.
Than
Great
if you
example.
have just a straight popular vote.
That's right.
Suddenly, Republicans are spending time in California.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
To try to peel off whatever Californian
all 5 of them. Yeah.
So whatever, or Democrats in Texas, although we've got big cities, so it's a little.
That's exactly right. So when we talk about institutions that way and talk about institutional racism, what we mean is that the rules of the game are such that people pursuing their own interests are going to produce outcomes, often unintentionally, right? That are racially disparate in ways that trouble us. And it's not because the people were necessarily racist. They might just be pursuing their self-interest, but the rules of the game are such that it leads to those outcomes, right? If for example, I mean, the classic economic example these days is minimum wage laws, right? Which it turns out that their origin was racist, but now explicitly so. But now the people who support, people don't know that but today people who support minimum wage laws are generally not racist and really are trying to do the right thing. But they create a system of incentives that lead people pursuing their self-interest, even if they're best of intentions, to disproportionately cause unemployment among African Americans, among people of color. So that's, I think, from a classical liberal perspective, this is where we can agree that the problem is institutional and structural. It's not about changing people's hearts. It's not, you need more black friends. It's not, right, those sorts. It's not, frankly, putting on a kente cloth and getting in, right? I mean, it's not that. It's about fundamentally thinking through how the rules of the game and how those institutions are structured in ways that a couple, now, for the skeptic, right? Part of the problem, I think, is that many of the folks on the left who adopt social justice, tend to say those institutions and rules were all of them were consciously created by racists for the purpose of racial discrimination. That's why they're there. And I think classical liberals can say, well, okay, sometimes, we can look at the history and say sometimes, but other times these institutions evolve and change. They are themselves emergent orders, right? And or disorders in this case. And sometimes they've come about in ways that, are more complicated than that, but nonetheless have those consequences, right? And
I think that's one skeptical approach. I think another skeptical approach, which I think I could be inclined to myself, is to say, I totally agree with the review of the rules of the game. And I've read Radley Balco and I'm 100% on board, and I've seen it firsthand in my own experience. I've talked about the people I've met over the years who've come from very different backgrounds, and their experience of the cops when it comes to drug use were wildly different.
Yep.
And whether or not you were, a rich kid in Greenwich, Connecticut, or a poor black kid in Newark, the way the cops treated you if they found drugs on you was very, very different.
I had a former colleague African-American colleague who used to say about students getting treated differentially. He says, if you go down to the courthouse, there's no justice, there's just us.
Right. And I think that's right. And I agree with that. And I think that, then you have this other layer. and I would put parts of something like the 1619 Project in this category, where you say that these are sort of unpatchable cracks in the foundation of their entire society, and that we're all kind of guilty with a sort of almost religious original sin.
Yep.
And so the only thing, and even though like my ancestors came to the United States post-bellum, they were in the early 1900s. They were,
as did mine,
poor, you know, if you're like Italian or Jewish or like so many, or if you're, you know, so many Americans have come post Civil War and can claim like, don't brand me with that.
Mm-hmm.
But even more importantly, don't brand me as an individual for like the sins of the father shouldn't beget the son. But even all of that rolls up to this notion that, well, no. It's all sort of part and parcel with a corruption that can't be cleansed, a kind of Macbeth moment of the spot that can't be removed from the hand, and therefore blow it all up along with Mount Rushmore. The Constitution is a slaveholder document, even with the amendments that got made. Tear that stuff apart. We need to start over. I don't have much of a vision for what that start over looks like. We'll get there from here, but the first step is tear it all down.
Yeah.
And I don't think everybody I know that is not the view held by many, maybe not most, but it's a vocal enough minority. And in some cases, they're vocal people in high places in our culture making this kind of claim.
Yeah.
And how do you grapple with that?
Yeah,
I think that's the wind. That's the reasonable wind that takes somebody like me and who's like 100% on board with a social justice framework that looks to the margins and says, how do we make sure the rules favor those people, not just as neutral, but actually is, if anything, bent towards the marginalized. And sort of kicks me out and calls me a racist and says like, well, you shouldn't be at the table for this conversation. I don't care what you have to say.
Yeah. So there's a lot going on there.
I know. I'm sorry. Like I monologued there, but I mean, I think right. I want to create a space for all these places to converge.
No, you've articulated, I think, an important set of critical ideas here, right? So part of it is, you know, deconstructing stuff is easy. Reconstructing stuff is not just hard, it's impossible, right? And so I wrote a piece a long time ago when I was writing regularly for Fee that sort of made the point that, look, you know, just because you can deconstruct something doesn't mean you can reconstruct it. And it also doesn't mean that as I was saying earlier, that the institutions...
Was it a letter to Noam Chomsky? Is that what
No, it was, but more importantly, the point I was making earlier, which is just because something creates bad outcomes doesn't mean it was consciously created ever, or even invented, whatever the purpose, invented by humans, right? I mean, you know, my own work, the family over the years didn't do very well by women and children, but it wasn't because we invented a family for that purpose. Rather, the long evolution of the family was such that's combined with other social forces, right? So I think there's that hubris, there's that constructivist rationalism in this movement that says we're going to tear it all down and rebuild it from the ground up. No, you're not. You can't. And this is where I think Hayek's important, right? To sort of talk about the idea that inherited institutions and traditions are important. Hayek's very clear to say there is space for us to improve upon those, and that we should always be mindful in doing so of, you know, the sort of least well off. And this is in Adam Smith too, right? But we can't reconstruct them all. We always have to have something that we hold on to. And so I think that's part of the response. And I think I love King's letter from Birmingham jail. And one of the reasons I love it is because he doesn't do that. What he does is to say, let's take these beliefs and institutions that we have that we are good, and let's hold ourselves to those. He's saying to America, to white America, do you really mean it when you say these things, right? And if you really mean it, here's what we should be doing. And so that is a different kind of critique, and more imminent critique, right? And I think we just have to continue to on this point about blowing everything up and reconstructing it, we have to continue to make this point that you're not, I wouldn't put it this bluntly, but you're not smart enough. None of us are smart enough to build institutions from the ground up. We can't imagine what the effects of that would be. We're the accumulated wisdom of tradition, and I'm not talking about, obviously not talking about slavery and things like this, but the accumulated wisdom of property rights and the liberal institutions that you want to blow up, that they were associated with slavery doesn't make them completely invalid. It means that there's room for improvement. And I also think, and I was watching this wonderful interview with Glenn Lowry that Reason just did, and Lowry makes the point, he says, let's look at the improvements to African Americans' material well-being over the last 50 years, much less the 100 or whatever, right? And he said, we can't deny that those, once freed, those institutions have served us reasonably well, not as well as they should have, but reasonably well. Why do we want to blow those up, right? And so I think that's one. I think there's a second part of your monologue that's a more difficult one, which is what I like to call the attempt to monopolize the moral high ground, which is to say, only we, whoever the we is, have moral truth. And therefore, if you're not on board 100% with us, you're out of here, right? We're pushing you off onto the ice floe, out into the, right? You're outside of civilized society. And this is the cancel culture, and this is Twitter, and this is all this kind of stuff. I wish I had a better answer for that, other than to say, I think that classical liberals have to challenge that attempted monopolization vociferously and frequently every chance we get. When people pull that nonsense, name it for what it is. And I think you just have to defend liberal institutions. You can't get defensive about your own. Don't go into, well, I got all these black friends. That's not going to work, right? But I think you have to be vociferous.
That's like the kind of stuff my grandmother would say.
Right, I know.
I loved dearly.
I know.
Grandmothers and grandfathers,
right.
But we're racist people because it's the generation, and they were
right. And I think the other thing
was like the check mark the box, like, oh no, I have. Marie
diversity,
right? Whatever the argument was, it was
right.
It's like
I know, but
tokenism.
Right, so right, but it's important not to be personally defensive. I think it's important to defend vociferously Western institutions, the good ones anyway, and sort of the importance of dialogue and freedom of speech and all that, and to just call out their bad faith. And to say, you're now reduced to name calling. What's the argument? You don't have a case here if all you can do is say I'm a racist because I disagree with you, right?
So,
and does it work? I don't know, but I know it's the right thing to do.
So your call, I think, is a really important one, because I think we're at a really dangerous time, is my perception, and I hope I'm like excessively worried, and it's like the early stages of grumpy old man syndrome coming. But the polarization that's happened in the country has left not a lot of room for a middle ground.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about and what you're advocating for is, in a very real sense, a nuance. It's a middle ground. It's a détente. It's to say, hey, you and I, in the big sense, we have a bunch of shared interests, and we have a bunch of things that we can argue about, but we can lock arms about abuse of power, about corruption, about structures that are rigged against, either intentionally or accidentally or historically, against people of color, and I think even more truly systematically than people of color per se is the poor, which happens to end up correlating strongly with people of color, which
is the problem that we want to fix, right?
Right. So I think you sometimes have this case where, whether it's prosecutorial misconduct or the access to a competent defender, or the costs of bail, or all these sorts of things that somebody like Riley Balco's like just unpacked and exposed. in many cases, the bias here is that if you're poor, they screw you.
Right.
And so that hits people of color disproportionately. Maybe is not necessarily racist per se. It has a kind of racial inequity as an outcome.
Yeah.
So I think you're saying, like, look, we got to lock arms on these things.
Yeah.
And I think there's never been a more important time to do that. Because if we don't lock arms on it, where do we head? From your perspective,
Right.
I have my thoughts, but where do you think we end up if we can't?
Yeah, nowhere good. I think the polarization is a huge problem, and I think the loss of ability, and I don't want to put more blame on one side or the other, but the loss of the ability to converse in good faith is a real problem. That's the root of this, right? And I think people on the right would say, well, look what the left has done to us. They started the culture war. They rammed their views down our throats, right? People on the left are saying, well, how can we have this is many of my academic friends from other disciplines. I can't have a conversation with someone who's a racist. I can't, platform, I don't like that word, but I can't even start, right? In a meaningful way because you're a racist, right? And they might or might not be. Just let me tell you a really quick story. So I live in this subdivision of about 36 houses in suburban Indianapolis. And we moved here 3 years ago. And these people are lovely. My neighbors are lovely. They have taken care of me and us when I've been sick, and they mowed shoveled our snow. And they're generally, most of them are lovely people. And New York Times had this map a while ago where you could get down very specifically to see sort of the split between Trump and Clinton in various neighborhoods and so on. And so, I thought, do I really want to know this, right? And I looked. It turns out, by the way, it's a little bit larger than my subdivision, but the area I live in is about 50-50. It's pretty purple, right? But still, right? One of the things is 50%
dogs and cats living together.
Right. But what it means is half of these people in the subdivision voted for Trump. And yet they came and probably some of those people helped out and took care of me and made offers and brought us coffee cake when we moved in. What do I do with that, right? I can't dismiss them as irredeemable, right? As whatever, right? Deplorables, right? I can't, because they're not. But at the same time, right, how do we have that conversation in good faith? And one of the things that I've done over the years, my years as an academic, is try to have those good faith conversations with my left-wing colleagues, right? Who I think are wrong about a lot of things, but they're just wrong. They're not evil. They're not bad. They're not trying to, they're not Stalinist, right? Most of them anyway. They're just wrong. They're wrong. And this is Hayek's point, right? We never attribute more than intellectual error. Okay. And, all right, so let's talk. Let's find those things, as you said, let's find those things we agree on and then have a conversation about what we don't. But the problem is people are fixated on the means. If you don't agree with my means for solving the problem, you therefore don't care about the problem. And I think that's another attitude that we need to challenge directly.
I think there's sort of two layers to this component, right? Because there's a contempt problem, which is something that Arthur Brooks has put a lot of focus on in recent years. This that contempt. He tells the story of a famous marriage counselor who basically says when you start to see one of the spouses roll their eyes as the other talks, that's contempt. It comes from a kind of place of disgust.
Yeah, and resentment.
And resentment, and just like, you are horrible, you are hideous. It's this disgust, revulsion place, and it's a particular place. It's different than disagreement. It's different than even anger. And he makes this point, and I think it's great, especially as a hot, fiery Italian, that like anger is actually okay. Like even screaming and yelling at each other, you can have makeup sex, like you can,
right.
But when you're rolling your eyes, that's like a cold death.
Yep.
And
been there,
I think, and I think we have that happening in the country, and it's bowling alone, and it's it's the people, the big sort, and there's these things that are happening where people are increasingly just clustering with like-minded people and holding
Yep.
contempt for the other side,
Yeah.
whatever
Yeah.
that other side is.
Right. And I don't, I think the only ways you get past that is you need to have intentional conversations, and even if you seeking them out is great, but even if you don't seek them out, organizations, who Center for the Study of Liberty, for example, who are trying to create these conversations across ideological boundaries and across these different things, and sort of realize that the people you are holding in contempt both ways are actually have the same concerns you do, and that what you disagree about is how best to fix them. I also think the other thing for me is many of these disagreements and much of the intellectual error is based on bad history, and people just not understanding history. I mean, I think not all the myths about the horrors of capitalism are the obvious one for me, right? And sort of more contemporary myths about economic growth and about war. I mean, Hans Rosling's Factfulness is, if you haven't read it, is awesome.
Right. There's a canon. There's a modern canon that includes the rational optimist and the better angels of our nature, and enlightenment now, and factfulness that
and Deirdre's stuff, right? But I wanted to teach a course. I'd love still to teach a seminar called Cornucopia, right? Where we read all these books and sort of say, I'm going to, look, I've talked about this in other places, but I think the opposite of that contempt and resentment, and Jonah Goldberg talks about this in his most recent book, the opposite of resentment is gratitude, right? And Adam Smith talked about this too, right? What sort of bothers me the most about both sides right now is a complete lack of gratitude, intellectually informed gratitude for the world that they live in. From the left, we want to tear all the institutions down and not realize that despite their real and genuine flaws, those institutions have made possible a world that our ancestors couldn't imagine, that your grandparents or whomever emigrated could not imagine, right? And on the other hand, the righties and conservatives are also lack gratitude, right, for the ways in which international and cosmopolitanism has improved their lives and made, right?
Or that not everything that has survived the process is good.
Right. Also true.
Not every tradition is worth preserving, because history is littered with terrible traditions that died at late death.
Yeah. And that we have, I mean, we have an obligation to work to improve the world, right? I mean, this is, I'm reading Rabbi Sachs right now, so I'm thinking a lot about Judaism and the idea of tikkun olam, to repair the world. Often, by the way, tikkun olam is translated by sort of progressive Jews as the equivalent of social justice and all that follows that we've been concerned about in this conversation. But if you actually look up what it literally means, repair the world. And the idea was that there are these holes, these missing spaces, and it's our obligation, our moral obligation, to sew them up, right? And I think that's a much better metaphor for where we find ourselves, right? The fabric is still good, it still works, but there's holes, right? There's holes, and we gotta find those. It's our obligation to find those holes and to fix them up. That's our obligation, to repair the world.
So there's another element. So we have to find, and I think this is at a personal level, at the individual level, we have to reject contempt and put ourselves in the position to be proven wrong, to have it's a kind of cognitive behavioral therapy. Like,
that's right.
Find someone that disagrees with you and agree to have a vociferous conversation that never gets personal or nasty.
That's right.
And it's the most, for me, it's the most exciting, stimulating kind of conversation to have, is because you will always learn something. You'll learn something about them. You'll learn something about your own perspective.
And to go with that, two things. One is, I'd rather make the mistake of being too generous to the people I disagree with than being not generous enough. Not everyone might agree with me on that, but I'm willing to be proven wrong that they really are bad people, as opposed to assuming that they are. I think along with that rejection of, part of contempt is hubris. So the rejection of contempt means humility. And I think that this is a virtue that classical liberals of all people should find easy to adopt, because our whole view of the world and how the world works is one of humility. we're not smart enough to design the world the way we might like. We rely on these transpersonal, these intersubjective institutions to guide us because we're not smart enough. We've come to where we are by relying on things that we don't completely understand. This is Hayek's whole sort of worldview, is one of humility. And I think that the tragedies of the 20th century were tragedies of hubris, of a lack of humility. So as we reject contempt, I think we have to adopt a conscious humility, and I think a willingness to learn, and a willingness, clearly signal a willingness to be proven wrong. Now, look, I'm pretty sure I'm right. Okay? I'm pretty sure I'm right about the world. I'm not 100% sure. I'm pretty sure. Okay, but that's a different question than the attitude one brings to the kind of conversations that you're talking about, right? Which is, okay, give me your best argument. Persuade me, right? Persuade me that I'm wrong. Because if you can show me that I'm wrong, I'm going to adopt your preferred thing. And one of the interesting things about Mises, right, is that Mises, even more than Hayek, was a brute systems utilitarian, right? Mises, look, if you could show me that socialism worked better, led to social cooperation and improved lives of poor, I'll become a socialist, because what I care about are the outcomes.
Right.
Turns out, doesn't work that way, right? So, but I think that we need to have that same sort of, okay, show me, right? Let's talk. And I think to insist in those conversations that the other person listen and not attempt to claim that monopoly on the moral high ground, because that's the thing that really drives me crazy. You can't, if I'm arguing against minimum wage laws, and then you just turn around and call me a racist, you're not interested.
Yeah, it's the conversation's over. So here's sort of the last, not the last perhaps, because these are long form conversations we have here on the Emergent Order podcast. But one of the things I find interesting, and I want to hear your take and may perhaps challenge it, because I think we maybe come down on these things differently, is I am generally kind of a fan of Jordan Peterson.
Oh boy.
So here we can practice what we just preached.
Right. That's right.
And and I think not for the reasons of what brought him to fame, because I don't.
Yeah. Right.
Although I think he was on a just crusade there about. He was protecting essentially what we're talking about in a sense. He was saying, look, free speech and compelled speech, and that in general that this, he uses this label that maybe is a brute force instrument. He calls this movement sort of postmodern neo-Marxists, is the way he puts it. Yeah. But I think other quarters of our friend group would say the critical theory types.
Yep.
That what we just were talking about rejecting contempt, about trying to have a dialectic, and acknowledging that there's a thing called empathy, that it can exist, and that we can put ourselves outside our own experience and learn. That there's a school of thought that says, no. That's not stuff. That there's only, I'm not quite sure, because I'm not studied enough in these thinkers. And so I think I have probably a skewed view of these thinkers, but the popularization of these ideas are properly, I think, represented by somebody like Peterson, which is to say, it is poison to allow you, the person I hate, to speak, because free speech, logic itself, science, these are sort of patriarchal Western male cis white
tools of oppression.
Yeah. And people and the critic, the reason why I take these seriously is because there's a lot of people who are true liberals, whether it's John McWhorter or Brett Weinstein or Jonathan Haidt or Steven Pinker or Sam Harris, who have never voted for a Republican, are cosmopolitan liberals, and they sound exactly like Jordan Peterson when they talk about this mindset, that it is a kind of anti-civilization, anti-West, anti-Enlightenment mindset.
Yeah, I think that's so.
So
That
why don't
piece-
you like Jordan Peterson?
That I think
That's because to me that's the
Yeah.
thing, that's his message.
well, I think I think the things I don't like in Jordan Peterson are things other than that.
Okay.
Okay, so I think
Maybe we don't even need to get into those.
well,
things,
but I would.
yeah.
I think there's a couple things to say here, right? I mean, I think, yeah, and we probably don't want to.
Because
go
how
into
can
it,
you
'cause
have
that'll take
how
us-
can you kill contempt if people say
right,
no
right,
you're
you
not
can't.
yeah.
Yeah,
How
you can't have a
get there from
conversation, and you can't have a discussion without those rules, without those institutions, without thinking that reason and logic and evidence, right? You can say that those have been used to bully people, to as an instrument of power to bully people, and I think that there's truth to that, right? But that doesn't make them inherently that. It means they can be used that way by people who might wish to for their own nefarious purposes. But you know, I think for people I mean, the sort of hardcore critical theory people, and again, I think there's a slice that gets a lot of attention that are the extremists in all of these things that don't necessarily represent all, you know, this. So colleagues of mine at St. Lawrence found critical theory to be very interesting and would sort of be sympathetic to Marx and sort of, you know, all the kind of things you think that Peterson might be talking about or that one would think of. But if you sat down and talked to them, right, they were, you know, they were using logic, they were trying to marshal evidence, and my favorite part, right, is that many of them taught writing, right, and would get upset when their students' papers were poorly organized. And I'm like, well, okay, they're just trying not to be oppressive, right? Well, I mean, no. So do they? You know, part of the problem here is there's theory and practice. I mean, this is, you know, the same colleagues who at St. Lawrence who were all upset when Walmart opened in the next town 10 miles, right? I go to a party a few weeks later, and someone's serving food, and one woman says to her, "Oh, those are really great storage containers. Where'd you get those?" And very sheepishly, she says, "Oh, Walmart," right? Because so there's a theory practice distinction here, and I think a lot of people talk a good game. Not to say, I mean, there really are people in positions of power in academia. If you really want to talk about academia, I think the real place that's a problem, and some of the classical liberals who've been writing, like Jason Brennan and Phil Magnus, who've been writing about this, have identified it. I would maybe even be stronger about it than they are, is in student affairs, right? That it's
Yes.
It's oftentimes the student affairs professionals, and I want to be really careful because I worked with them for many years and I love them as people, but they're simply
what is student affairs? For
so
those
the
of
people
us
who
for
are
whom colleges a long time ago,
who are responsible for the residence halls and orientation and sort of all this co-curricular, extracurricular activities that students engage in that aren't sports, and they're often extraordinarily well-meaning, but haven't had to think about two things. They're just not trained to think about the larger social science issues, but they also have never thought seriously about things like academic freedom and why diverse voices are important for learning. I mean, that's just not what they're trained in for a variety of reasons. And so, you know, faculty get upset because we still, more than they do for sure, value those things, right? And so I think that's part of the problem. And they're often the worst offenders in terms of seeing these, you know, Western practices and institutions as being tools of oppression. And I think it's, you know, go back where we started with universities and sort of now Jordan Peterson's stuff. I mean, I think it is incumbent upon the Steven Pinkers, as you say, the sort of liberals, right, to step up and defend themselves and defend the things that they're doing. I mean, I think, you know, Haidt's been great, and Heterodox Academy is a good development as a place to do this, but it's hard when the forces of culture, when the New York Times is kicking out Bret Stephens, right?
yes,
It's an uphill battle.
So like, this is my, you know, I brought up Jordan and you rolled your eyes, and it was
Well,
you
I didn't know where
roll
you
your
were
eyes
going.
towards me.
No, I didn't know where you were going. I just am tired. I'll put it this way. I think many people find him interesting. Some people find him useful. I just don't think he's a classical liberal, and I don't think he's someone we want to hold up as a role model. The other people you name there, by contrast, are, right?
So I think
So that's why I rolled my eyes.
I understand. This is partly a temperamental thing, I think, for us perhaps. But I think one of the things about not just Jordan, I put Jordan in the category with Haidt in the sense that I think what his big picture story is hyper individualized in the sense, I mean, it's very Misesian in a way, because what he basically is saying all along is he operates at two levels, but his basic is you have to sort of take care of yourself and don't think you can remake the world before you make your bed. And
clean your room, yeah.
And I actually think that is quite profound, and it's easily mocked, but I think it's quite profound, and it is a scold, but it's a useful scold.
I don't know if I'd call it profound, but that doesn't mean it's not true.
No, I think it's profound, and here, let me make the argument for why, because I think that actually, what he's done that I think most classical liberals fail to do is he brought the abstraction down into reality. And he's actually made manifest this concept that is very hard to get your head around. And that's methodological individualism, like the cornerstone of thought of classical liberal thinking. For me, it's one. It's like methodological individualism. People choose. Individual minds choose and decide. Subjective value, peace. And you kind of got those.
I put exchange in it. Subjective value, exchange, peace. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that, but I think more broadly, he fits into this group because he's coming through the psychology door.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that's been very interesting to me in recent times, because I think that I'm a systems-oriented person, and so I snap into rules of the game and institutions and principles and ethics and the categorical imperative and these sorts of things that, like, oh, the categorical imperative, it's like the golden rule. Like, if a rule can't be applied everywhere, it shouldn't be applied. It's like, there's a type, and I'm in that category that stuff works.
Yeah.
But then you have this other issue of, yeah, but what's in it for me? How do I figure out how to get around in the world? And that's where he exists. But then I think that's one level in which I think he's really valued. I think we have a lot, we the cerebral classical liberals need to take what works of him more seriously.
Well, and
in a deeper way than I think, because there's plenty of people who are kind of like, I'm just going to be mean and call them kind of knuckle dragging right wingers who gravitate towards him poking people.
Right.
And I don't have any interest in that.
Right.
That's not interesting to me.
Right.
But I think that there's this other critique. This, like you've said, okay, well, it's these people that run like the dorms. Yeah. I think it's a lot broader than that. I mean, I think it's a mentality that has echoed. One of the things I've Hayek's paper, The Intellectuals in Socialism, is always in play for me.
Yep.
Because I consider myself to be kind of a secondhand dealer in information, which is this concept of, you've got the intellectual class and the academics, and they have these sort of blackboard ideas. And then they make their way out until you have a hashtag or a meme or a rap video.
Yep. And
I think there's something, it disturbs me a lot that this cancel culture, Twitter, like dumpster fire, there's no slander against Twitter that I won't agree with. And I don't really
we agree on
very much, because it is really, it's all dopamine, no serotonin.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Is,
I use it, but sparingly.
It's so do you not take it? It seems like you don't take that quite as you're not as worried about that as I am, clearly. Like, why aren't you more worried about that, or do you think I'm overreacting?
Well, so here's me sort of trying to live up to my own principles of conversation, which is, it may be the particulars of my experience in academia may lead me to look at this through rosier glasses than is justified. I have a tendency, as you know, right? I'm a hardcore sort of optimist.
Yeah.
Right.
You're a cornucopian.
I'm right. It's hard to get me to be, even in the face of my own medical stuff right now, right? I still am convinced somehow that I'm going to live to 90, whatever, but, and I might, right? I can't operate any other way anyway. So, I'm incorrigible that way. And so maybe that's a flaw of mine. I mean, I'm basing this on my own experience in a way, and it causes me to underplay how bad it is more generally out there. I am convinced that this is a problem of elite institutions in general. That doesn't necessarily mean it's less of a problem, right? Because they're elite institutions. But I think, at least in academia, the sort of rank and file academic is too busy teaching class and trying to write a couple papers and sitting on committees to be too concerned with this stuff. But at the top, right? At the top, it's a real problem. And now I think what was it Andrew Sullivan said? We're all academia now, right? We're all on college campuses, right? And that, I think, to me, is the thing that concerns me. When, when the virus was quarantined to college campuses, okay, right? That's one problem, and that's an avoidable institution or whatever. But it's clearly now, I mean, the 1619 is a good example of ways in which it's spread, and the Bret Stephens thing, and all the other things we've seen in the last couple months.
I just saw Matt Taibbi's written a piece about, out of deep concern for the. I mean, he's one of the most interesting progressive thinkers I know of, and he's saying we're journalism as a concept is under threat because of this mentality.
And this is an age thing too, right? I mean, there's a dividing line somewhere in there. Maybe it's 30. I don't know what the age is, but if you're under it, you're in on cancel culture. I mean, it's interesting to watch my daughter. She told me you're going to figure out a way to work. She said, you're going to figure out a way to work me into that conversation. So here you go, Rachel, who is in New York City and an actress and in the Broadway world and sort of has seen one play she was working as, she was directing or directing, I guess. The stuff came out about the guy who wrote it or was producing it, that he had a history of questionable gender behavior, and the actors all walked out and the thing literally got canceled. I mean, so she's lived this, and she's more skeptical about it, and maybe because she's my daughter, right? I mean, she's not a big one to sort of want to go cancel everybody, but to say, come on, you gotta be reasonable here, right? There's sins and there's sins, and I think that's so there's some of that, but you can see with her and her friends sort of what these mid-20 somethings, that this is the thing, and I do worry about it. And part of me wants to say, maybe when you all are older and have the stuff of adulthood, if you have the stuff of adulthood, that you'll see these things differently. It's easy when you're sort of single or married, no kids, and then I don't know. I just don't know. I worry about this, but I want to come back to another point though. I think two things, actually. One quick one. Before there was Hayek rap videos, I always thought one of the most important things classical liberals had to do was to do what you said, was to take the abstract and make it concrete artistically. That you don't want to be dogmatic about it, right? You want to. I mean, that's what's so great about the videos, and probably why I was skeptical, because I was thinking in terms of sort of some more dogmatic presentation, right? But so what we don't want is libertarian art. That's not what we want. I mean, channeling my wife here, who would be nodding were she in the room. What we want is really good art that has themes and messages that are, that get across to people the importance of those ideas or liberal institutions or so on, right? I mean, you can have the endless debate about where Ayn Rand fits into that, which of those categories
I think she's an interesting case study in
but
trials and tribulations on that front.
But you can't deny the influence, right? I mean, I might not be here were it not for. So I think that's really important. I also think, and this goes back to Jordan Peterson, I also think, and Jonathan Haidt, the interest in psychology that we're seeing is really important too. Sort of, you're right that we probably haven't focused enough on the way in which individual behavior can help promote and sustain and channel liberal values. And so I've written on parenting from that same place, right? Which is how we parent might matter a great deal for whether our kids adopt those liberal values or reject them, right?
I'm working on a film right now exactly focused on this precise issue.
Yeah. So right. And I think that all of, we've underplayed these things. And so this actually ties into some of the broader history we were talking about earlier too. I think the problem historically has been for classical liberals, it's been the market versus the state, right? There it is, right?
Two abstractions.
And as if that were it, right? When in fact, there's this whole realm of civil society and all these other institutions and all these other things that matter to human beings, religion being another, right? That we haven't really talked about in ways that matter to people, right? So, you know, I'm reading Rabbi Sachs, but I have an ongoing fascination with how to talk about classical liberalism being consistent with Jewish values, right? And you know, why should serious Jews be more sympathetic to classical liberals? That's it to me. I think there's an answer to that question, and I want to explore it. And so all of these things, right, are ways.
Have you been talking to Russ lately? Because you know.
No. Yeah. No.
You really got to pick up the phone and talk to Russ.
Right. Every time I see Russ, this is the conversation. We have a version of this conversation. I haven't seen him for a while. And by the way, I still have never been on his show. Which I don't have. I mean, John, I don't have too many bucket list items, right? But one of these days, come on, Russ, one of these days, right? So, but that's a bucket list item. Anyway, but yeah, so I mean, all these things, I think that these areas that we haven't talked about. One, the market versus the state thing is mostly decided, not completely, but mostly decided, and it certainly got decided with the fall of the wall and those sorts of things, right? And that sort of breaking apart of the right coalition, I thought would happen, and did happen, just not the way I expected. So now has opened up classical liberals to talk about these other kinds of things, because that's where the interesting questions are. I think some of the stuff, for example, that Mercatus has done and the interest in the Ostrom's work reflects this idea that, hey, you know what? Communities matter too, and how communities solve problems in ways that don't neatly fit into market or state. Yeah, let's talk about that.
Well, I think
one more quick point here
please.
Too. I think the other problem, and this is a sort of more little inside baseball thing among classical liberals and libertarians, you know, is that the more anarchist leaning libertarians get petrified every time you talk about these social problems like race and gender and so on, or talk about, you know, how do we talk to the left? Because they think, right, some of them, many of them think if you're going to talk about the gender wage gap, you must want a state-driven solution, or you're going to talk about environmental issues, you must want a state-driven solution. No, we can talk about those things and talk about market solutions, or talk about community solutions, or talk about cultural solutions. The best thing we could do to reduce the gender wage gap is to have men taking on more responsibility at home, right? That's a cultural problem. State's not going to solve that problem, and it's not a market problem. It's a cultural problem. So let's talk about that. And I think that's an unwillingness to engage those conversations. It's Students for Liberty and the sort of the younger generation of libertarians are much more willing to engage this than my generation was. But I think but that is a problem that folks just don't want to talk about those issues. Well, for fear that it leads to statism. It's an entryway drug to statism.
Well, it is funny because it's like there is especially in that academic land, right? Because you've got the sort of blackboard economics model. Yeah. So I have identified something that is imperfect, therefore right. Government.
Therefore, right. Yeah. I call that
this does not, therefore that.
Right. It's the ipso facto leap, I like to call it.
Right? So, but to sort of bring our conversation to a close and come back to social justice, I think how should we, from your perspective, taking into account this maybe more impactful critical theory and its popularizers mindset, this identity politics, this, we all have our own truth. It's like, I have my truth, you have your truth. We can't really compare our truths because it's only particular to me. But if I have different skin color, then we've got the same truth or something. Like the identity politics thing, I think is something we have to grapple with if we want a liberalism that can survive our times.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So how, take it home for me from your, grapple with, how do we get to a place where we have a liberalism, classical or otherwise, that is trying to work on these problems and move past identity.
Yeah.
Even while grappling with the fact that we do have disparities and people
that's right.
Birds of a feather do tend to flock together. And like, you go to India and they call darker skinned Indians of lower class black people. This is deep stuff we're grappling with.
Right. So I think the first thing we do is we recognize that that's a problem, and we talk about it, and we don't deny it. And we say there are racial, gender, whatever disparities, and to say that at least, not necessarily all of them, but many of them are a problem, right? I mean, if most of the gender wage gap might be explained by things we don't think are problematic, right? Maybe it
personal preferences.
Yeah, right. So, but at least we have to admit, it's not even a matter of admitting, it's just true that those problems are there. And I think it's just true that we can talk about the problems that create the problems. So I think that sense, we have to not deny that the problems exist. I think we have to always this is the bleeding heart libertarian thing, right? We always have to put forward our concern with the least well off, whether that's material, whether that's racially, whether it's whatever, right? That we are siding with those who are oppressed. And a word we haven't used at all, this 2 hours, we haven't used this word. And that we object and we reject privilege. The original classical liberals were opponents of privilege, monopoly privilege, all of these forms of and we can say, right, two things. State granted privilege is the problem we're usually concerned about, but we can admit white privilege is a real thing, right? As you said, I'm going to get treated differently by the justice system if I'm caught with drugs than my African-American friend is. And I've seen it being out with friends of color, right? You just see people treat you. I mean, it's real. Okay. So, and we can be opponents of privilege and always put that forward too. And I think we have to have concrete proposed solutions to those problems. So, when Justin Amish puts this qualified immunity and the rest of that bill together, I mean, yes, right. That's what we need. And give him full props here for getting Democratic co-sponsors and even one Republican co-sponsor. It might not go anywhere, but that's what we need to do. We need to show our good faith if we want people to treat us with good faith. And it might suck that the burden's on us to take the first step, but I think it is on us because our reputation for not caring about those issues isn't wrong, right? It's just not wrong, or at least not putting them front and center isn't wrong. And so I think the burden is on us to say, look, we really do care. We have cared. It's deep in our tradition, this objection to privilege, this analytical egalitarianism, all these sorts of things, right? And we mean it, and we're trying our best. So give us that, and we'll give it. We believe you guys mean well. Even if we disagree about what the best way to get there is. So grant us that as well. So I think that's what we have to do. And I think last point, maybe, none of this means we have to accept the entire agenda of the social justice crowd. So 2 points. One, the really serious, crazy theory folks who you can't even have a conversation with, then you can't have a conversation with them. But there's plenty of folks that everyone out protesting is not a critical theorist, right? So there's plenty of people out. Right. There's plenty of people out protesting who are in fact liberals in the broadest sense of the term, or progressives in the broadest sense of the term, who we can have conversations with if we do it right. And watching our rhetoric, and so, like, if what we leave, oh yeah, we hate Trump, well, let me put it the other way. So libertarians say, well, Trump's not all bad because he deregulated a bit and changed the tax code, right? Meanwhile, he's crumbling Western institutions, right? Political institutions. Right? Get a sense of priority here, folks, right?
Right.
So sort of dealing, let's also say to our friends on the left in particular, we agree with you about what the important issues are. We're not just about reducing the tax rate. We're not libertarians, or not just conservatives who want to smoke dope. We care about those things, and we want to get them right.
I think you make a really important point there at the end, which is and people like Bernie Sanders is the most popular person to make this exact kind of hideous argument, which is to say, well, sure, Castro did some bad things, but what about the literacy rate? Yeah. It's like, okay, okay.
There's a lot of people, a lot of Cubans who died in the Caribbean who might disagree with you.
Right. There's a sort of wacky proportionality problem in the cherry picking.
Yeah.
And I do think when it comes to the president that mostly because presidents don't matter as much as we think they do because of the structure of the government, the rhetoric, the willingness to the bully pulpit has been abused in ways that are truly heinous, but it's even worse than that. And so like when you say like, oh well, he's kind of shredded the institutions of Western sort of governance,
right?
But the tax rate,
right? No, you sound like an idiot.
That is Bernie Sanders apologetics for communist whack jobs and Sandistas and all the rest of the people that he finds a reason to apologize for. So it's the same thing. It's the same.
No, that's a great point.
And I think it's a super important project to say there's a sensible sort of middle. And that there's a 15% over here and a 15% over here who we can't have a good conversation with.
Right, we can't, right. And it's okay to say, no, let's talk to the people who are open to meaningful conversation. And
I'm often guilty of, I'm fiery, so I can often be guilty of that. And yet I think like the thing I try to strive for, especially in the work, is what is manifest in these rap videos. So a video editor that's worked up with us on a number of projects is very much a very staunchly like liberal Democrat, and he adores the Mises versus Marx video. He just adores it. And he just loves, and I know a little. Relative to the other two, the comments section of the Mises Marx is slightly different. Yeah. Because even though I feel like we treated Marx pretty fairly, it's almost impossible to take on Marx and get people who like Marx to take your treatment of him. Oh, that's not the real Marx. It's so much worse than that's not the real Keynes.
Yeah, no, it is. And that was, when I watched that video the first time, I thought, okay, this is I think it's the right one, but this is a reading of Marx, and one people think would say, no, that's not really what Marx said. But it's funny. One of my flaws is that, like you, I'm fiery, though perhaps in a different way, and I don't always live up to my own principles as well as I wish I did.
None of us do.
No, none of us do. And my wife stops me from doing stupid things on Facebook. But I think if I ever needed to make some money, I'd offer a subscription to my Facebook friends and followers and say, you can subscribe to the Horwitz things I didn't post on Facebook feed, right? And see what, that's because there's, I write them and then delete them sometimes. It's like, you really don't want to do that, Steve.
What's next for you, Steve?
So, good question. The big sort of news next month is I have this, Austrian Economics and Introduction monograph. It's a short book coming out through libertarianism.org, through CATO's libertarianism guides thing, and some folks snuck in and got it early and seemed to like it. So that has multimedia content. I recorded several video and audio lectures, and that'll go up. Interestingly, it was 3 years ago now. It was before I got sick, so that'll be interesting to watch from my end. So that's an exciting thing. I have another really big exciting thing that will become public in early September that I can't talk about, but I'll vague book it now. Everyone will be very happy for me. Let's put it that way. But other than that, I got a few other smaller projects. The big thing for me is we just got big grants for this new institute at Ball State, and so I'm working on making that happen. And frankly, happy that I'm really healthy right now and trying to work hard to make it stay that way. That's, that hovers over everything else.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I love you, Steve. You're one of my favorite people. And keep fighting the good fight against those. You've got an invisible enemy that you got to worry about at all times right now. So
yeah, not so. It's interesting, one of the good days are the days I forget, right? And there's more of those right now because there's nothing happening to me. There's no little warning light right on my panel that says, hey, remember so other than, I can't go chasing the dog like I used to, but I'm also 56. So even if
well, you've managed to hang tough on a 2-hour conversation that spanned a lot of big ideas. And
my pleasure.
Here's to many more to come.
I hope so. That's my plan. I'm not going anywhere anytime soon.
All right, Steve, we'll have a good one. Thanks for participating in the conversation.
Take care, John.
Keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you, sir. Always my pleasure to hang with you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Emergent Order podcast. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting app. If you're interested in being a guest, shoot us an email at podcast@emergentorder.com. Our producer is Jesse Bennett. Thanks again, and speak to you next time.